The Psalms are much more honest with emotions than we are. We often hide how we feel, not only from others, but also from ourselves or from God. We might feel pressure to say that we're fine, even when our lives are crumbling. But the Psalms can open a pressure release valve that allows us to be vulnerable in the safety of God's love. Psalm 6, to the choir master, with stringed instruments, according to the Sheminith, a psalm of David. O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are troubled. My soul also is greatly troubled. But you, O Lord, how long? Turn, O Lord, deliver my life. Save me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise? I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. My eye wastes away because of grief. It grows weak because of all my foes. Depart from me, all you workers of evil, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. The Lord has heard my plea. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies shall be ashamed and greatly troubled. They shall turn back and be put to shame in a moment. In this lament, David is clearly suffering, but we get hints, not specific details, about the circumstances of his suffering. In the early church tradition, this was the first of 7 penitential psalms that were recited on Ash Wednesday. And indeed, David does speak of God's discipline and rebuke, so he could be suffering as a result of his own sin. He mentions foes, so he could be facing opposition, like in Psalms 3 and 5. He prays for healing, so he could be ill or injured. It could be all of the above or a combination of them, but in some ways the specifics are not important. The point is that this suffering has been going on for a long time. In verse 3, David prays, "But you, O Lord, how long?" In the Psalms, when someone is experiencing new, fresh distress, the cry is, "Why, O Lord?" But when the anguish is extended, and there is no end in sight, the prayer is, "How long?" As Tim Keller puts it, this is the cry of someone who has walked with more pain and sickness than he thought he could ever bear. Or as Derek Kidner writes, the psalm gives words to those who scarcely have the heart to pray and brings them within sight of victory. For many of us who have suffered for weeks or months or years, whether physically or emotionally, this psalm is an invitation to enter into that pain unapologetically and without guilt. We cry out to God and we find him in the midst of our trouble. As I mentioned at the beginning, David is remarkably honest about how he is suffering. In verse 2, he says that he's languishing, which means to wither, to be sucked of all your vitality. David's bones and soul are troubled. His whole person feels it. This is a good reminder that the biblical authors know how the inward and outward parts of our humanity affect each other. There's a connection between what we experience in our bodies and what we experience in our minds and emotions. In verses 6 and 7, David gives full vent to all that he's feeling. He says, "I'm weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with all my weeping. My eye wastes away because of grief. It grows weak because of all my foes." These are weary tears. On the one hand, he has too many tears, an ocean of sorrow. But on the other hand, he doesn't have enough energy. He's wasting away. He's growing weaker. Now, if we were to hear a spiritual leader today talk like this, we would be very embarrassed for them. But those who have really suffered know that embarrassment doesn't matter when you are in the valley of the shadow of death. And David does invoke death. In verse 5, he asks God to deliver him, for in death there's no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise? The concept of Sheol is worth explaining because it shows up often in the Psalms. It's a way of describing what was likely an earlier understanding of the place for the dead. It's the underworld, and sometimes it's just a synonym for death itself. We should not read it like David is musing on the philosophical and theological state of being that we experience after death. Rather, David is using poetic, evocative language to describe the depths of his despair. He's saying, if I sink any lower, if my life ends, if death were to grasp me and pull me down, I'd be lost. My worship of God would end. And is there anything worse than that? The tragedy of death is at the front of David's mind. But despite all this pain, the psalm takes a turn at the end that is surprising and deeply encouraging. For all David's cries of help, his petitions and prayers to God are only in the first 4 verses. Rebuke me not, be gracious to me, heal me, turn, deliver my life, save me, and so on. But the second half of the psalm starts with David's weeping and then ends with a tone of defiant faith. Depart from me, all you workers of evil, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. So this psalm presents us with a very different tone towards David's enemies than what we've seen so far in the Psalms. David simply dismisses his opposition. He waves them away because God has heard his tearful prayers and will act on his behalf. David is confident that God is listening, even though he hasn't done anything yet about the circumstances. In verse 9, he says that the Lord has heard his plea, and then in the next verse he says that someday God will deal with his enemies. And David's confidence grows even further when we understand what he's saying in the original Hebrew. So the words that David uses in the beginning of the psalm to describe his pain are the very same words that he uses at the end of the psalm to describe God's deliverance. Be gracious to me, in verse 2, has the same root as the plea in verse 9. Both of them are a cry for mercy. He prays for grace, and God gives it. David's bones are troubled, but his enemies shall be greatly troubled. It's the same word. His prayer for God to turn and notice him is answered by his enemies turning back and retreating due to God's salvation. And the poetic repetition goes further in the last verse. All my enemies shall be ashamed and greatly troubled. They shall turn back and be put to shame in a moment. The words for turn and shame sound very similar in Hebrew. It's yevashu and yashuvu. David's becoming a slam poet, wielding words like weapons. And yet all this wordplay, it isn't just for style. David is showing that even though his suffering was long and wearying, the exact things that he prayed for are answered by the God who hears. David's tears were not in vain. He is not alone. I don't want to miss an important line in the center of the psalm. Save me for the sake of your steadfast love. Other translations say, for the sake of your loving kindness or your mercy. They're all trying to capture what is perhaps one of the most important Hebrew words in the Bible. The word is chesed, and it describes God's covenantal love, the special relationship that he has with his people. I like to translate it as loyal love. Chesed is God's complete commitment to keep his promises, no matter the circumstances and no matter the cost. So David is naming God's chesed, his loyal love, as the reason why God should save him from his suffering. All that he is experiencing would be utterly unbearable were it not for the certain knowledge that God keeps his promises. He never abandons his people. And today, we can have the same confidence, especially because we know that God's steadfast love became flesh and dwelt among us in the person of Jesus. Jesus suffered. God himself experienced physical weakness, emotional distress, and outside opposition. Jesus wept, and he did all this so that he could be disciplined by God for our sin, even though he knew no sin. He was rebuked for our evil. The wrath that we deserve fell on him. God heard his own son's weeping on the cross, and he did not deliver him. Jesus experienced the darkness of Sheol until 3 days later, when the enemy of death was put to shame, Jesus rose from the dead, and one day he will return to put an end to all weeping, all sickness, all hatred, all pain, and all death. Until he returns, God's people pray, "How long, O Lord? How long must we suffer in this fallen world? How long until you return and make all things new?" And we not only pray how long, we also pray the final prayer of the Bible. Come quickly, Lord Jesus. Come back soon. How could you use Psalm 6 to guide your prayers? Here are some examples of situations where this psalm can speak into your life. When you are injured or sick or have chronic pain and healing is slow to come, or as far as you can tell, it might even be impossible. When you are weak, fatigued, unable to move or do all that much, and you feel helpless in your own body. When you want to meditate on God's chesed, his loyal love that endures despite our circumstances. When fear, grief, or guilt keeps you from being able to sleep, or when you find yourself crying yourself to sleep night after night. When you feel attacked, shamed, troubled by enemies and the foes who condemn you. When you long for God to move because it has been too long since you saw evidence of his work. When you are at your darkest point, when silence and loneliness and coldness are your only companions in the long watches of the night. When you fear death and your eternal fate feels uncertain. When you have a deep sense that God is listening to you, that he is paying attention to your suffering. When you are waiting and waiting and waiting for something to finally go your way, for any kind of win. When you grieve the loss of someone close to you and you feel like you'll weep every day for the rest of your life. When you find peace, grace, mercy, and acceptance in God's answers to your prayers. Psalm 6, to the choir master with stringed instruments, according to the Sheminith, a psalm of David. O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are troubled. My soul also is greatly troubled. But you, O Lord, how long? Turn, O Lord, deliver my life. Save me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise? I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. My eye wastes away because of grief. It grows weak because of all my foes. Depart from me, all you workers of evil, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. The Lord has heard my plea. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies shall be ashamed and greatly troubled. They shall turn back and be put to shame in a moment. Thank you for listening to the Woven Psalms. This podcast is a ministry of Rock Hill Community Church in Duluth, Minnesota. I'm Mike Solis. I'm a pastor at Rock Hill and the writer of this podcast. Ethan Gibbs is our producer, editor, and composer of the theme music. Our logo was designed by Bo Walsh. This podcast uses the English Standard Version published by Crossway. We want to give a special thanks to Poor Bishop Hooper for allowing us to use the music from their Every Psalm project. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please share it with others. You can learn more about our work at wovenpsalms.com.